to continue our discussion on B cells. In the previous video, I kind of showed you in detail, step by step with the cell, with the B cell being activated. All right. There are some other terms in there that I didn't use that I'm going to kind of clarify now. Okay. And those terms are going to be clonal selection, clonal expansion, and then we also have clonal deletion. That can happen, okay? And in terms of clonal selection, that's what we'll start with first. Remember when I was going over the activation of the B cell, I drew a second one in there. And I'm going to draw a couple here just to kind of demonstrate. And I drew kind of the different antibodies on the outside. Okay? So in terms of that, these are going to be our naive B cells. All right. What happens in the process of clonal selection? This is where the antigen comes into play. Okay. With clonal selection, we got the one, and I'll use a triangle because I used a triangle in the last one. An antigen bound to our naive B cell, okay? This is now the selection of our B cell that is going to go through the process of activation so that it can produce the plasma cells, okay? So the clonal selection is really from the pool of B cells that you have. And in terms of your immune system, you have hundreds and thousands of B cells that are floating around in your bone marrow. Some of them are still naive because they haven't encountered antigen yet. Those that have encountered antigen are going to go through the maturation process and activation process. All right? So clonal selection means essentially what you've got there in your bone marrow. You've got individual clones. These are the individual cells, if you want to think of it that way, that are hanging out in your bone marrow waiting to come across antigen. All right? So when we select one of our clones, that means antigen is bound to it. Okay? So in terms of that, that's going to be the clonal selection. All right? And in terms of what happens then, all right? Remember, we've got the antigen that's going to be presented on the outside of our B cell now. And it's going to, I'll use orange again. Just like that. All right, this is our antigen presentation. And in terms of that antigen presentation then, this is going to be where our T cell comes along. Oh, and I'll put one over here just because it's easier to draw my T cell over here. All right. This is our T helper cell now, right? And our T helper cell secretes those cytokines. The cytokines then that are secreted by that T helper cell, that is then going to be what leads to our expansion. All right? So in terms of clonal expansion then, this is where essentially we're telling this one cell that it needs to divide and it's going to make lots of plasma cells. All right? Because in the terms of producing those antibodies, when I draw it in the previous video, I just showed you one plasma cell producing antibodies. In reality, if you can have more cells making antibodies, you're going to be more efficient at taking out whatever that pathogen is. So in terms of our selection involves the antigen binding to our B cell. That B cell then presents the antigen on the outside of it. The T helper cell comes along, secretes those cytokines. What those cytokines tell that cell to do is essentially make more cells. So it tells it to proliferate, it tells it to undergo mitosis. Now we get the plasma cells that are going to start pumping out our antibodies. Okay? So in terms of your book, when you're reading about clonal selection, clonal expansion, and B-cell activation, they all kind of go under the same heading. All right? So the selection is essentially the antigen binding. The expansion is after we get that B-cell activated, telling it to make more plasma cells. And then in terms of that, the last stage associated with our process would be our memory cell. Okay? This one is going to be the one that can be activated quickly, because in terms of that, all right, our memory cell has already undergone the activation process. So our memory cell doesn't need a T helper cell to come in for it to start making antibodies. If this memory cell encounters antigen again, if it encounters our pathogen, it's going to automatically go back to being a plasma cell, and it's going to start making those antibodies, so that you either don't get as sick or you may not get sick at all. All right? So in terms of that, we've got our clonal selection. We've got here expansion. All right? And then in terms of that, there is a third process associated with B cells. And I'm going to put this over here. The third process is clonal deletion. All right? Now, clonal deletion isn't going to have a part of this process here. Okay? What clonal deletion is, it's going to prevent the recognition of self. So in terms of the B cells that are made within your body, the possible combinations, there will be some combinations made that will recognize tags that are on the outside of your cells. Now in terms of that, that ends up being detrimental, because if you tell your immune system to start destroying your own cells, that causes bad things to happen. So clonal deletion essentially takes out any harmful, we'll call them harmful, B cells. All right? Essentially, this is so you don't attack your own cells. And in terms of that clonal deletion, people who have autoimmune diseases, it's believed that there is some misfire or something goes haywire in the process of clonal deletion, and those B cells that can recognize your own cells are not deleted. All right? So in terms of that clonal deletion, an autoimmune disease, that's one way that that's believed to occur. Now, in terms of autoimmune disease, the thing that we don't know is what triggers this to happen or not happen. All right? Now, in terms of those autoimmune diseases, there can be other causes for it, but in the autoimmune diseases in general, you're talking about the immune system now no longer having the specificity that we've been talking about. All right? It's not recognizing specific antigens. Okay? So that's another way that that can kind of go haywire. So in terms of B cell activation, clonal selection, and we'll underline clonal expansion, those are going to be part of B cell activation. All right? Part of the process of B cells developing within the bone marrow also involves clonal deletion. That clonal deletion is going to remove any B cells that recognize self. Okay? Because what you want to have are B cells that recognize non-self. Non-self is the foreign stuff, things like pollen, things like bacteria, things like viruses. All right? Non-self. You don't want to be taking out your own cells. All right? Hopefully that makes sense. If you have any questions, please let